Welcome to our live chat with Vicky Ward and all things Epstein. Let me see if I need to re-invite her here. Desktop function. Invite guests. She's invited. She should have an alert here to join in just a second. And appreciate all of you for joining us here to dive into all of that. There's obviously a lot of news happening. We're watching all things Epstein. We're watching what's been going on in Arizona with the search for Nancy Guthrie. Along with everything else going on in the news in Washington. Welcome, everybody, for joining. There's no way to re-invite her, huh? We're waiting for Vicky Ward to join us. It says she's invited. Hold on, search her name again when you go to the invite option.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm going to step out while I deal with the technical difficulties.
Okay. See here. Sorry for the tech issues, folks. Let me just see if I can do this. If I type in her name. Sorry, we're on the phone with her right now trying to have her come in. Oh, there she is. I'm seeing somebody. But she's frozen. Oh, now her camera's off.
No, we're here.
Oh, we're here.
We're here.
We made it work. Vicky, thank you so much.
No, sorry about all that. God, you would think by now.
No.
You would think by now.
There's always
we could sort out, and I've got to move. I'm in the wrong place. We could sort out our tech difficulties, or I could sort out my tech difficulties, but no. Anyway, it's really nice to talk to you.
It's great to be speaking with you. Special shout out to Sari Safer, who put this all together. And you're incredible reporting. We got to talk to you a while ago when you put out the book on the Idaho 4.
Yeah.
And I know you're working on another book right now on Luigi Mangione. But one of the stories you've been covering for a couple decades now is all things Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to get to here. But I want to begin with how you began with the story, Vicky, back in 2002 at Vanity Fair. How you first got that assignment.
Yes, no, I know. So here's the irony. Here is the great irony. I was given the assignment of Jeffrey Epstein in the fall of 2002 because I had a high-risk, complicated multiple pregnancy. And my boss at the time at Vanity Fair, Graydon Carter, thought it would be easy for me because he lived in New York. I live in New York. And, I was used to, I'd done a big piece out in California. I was used to sort of traveling. And Jeffrey Epstein's name had popped up in the New York Post, and which had mentioned that he'd flown Bill Clinton and a bunch of other VIPs to Africa on a charity mission. And Graydon Carter said to me, I've heard about this mysterious man for a while now. He lives in the biggest townhouse in Manhattan, but nobody knows really anything about him, and nobody knows how he made his money. Just go find out how he made his money.
It was a story about money. There were no allegations about women at that point.
No. So off I go. And immediately alarm bells, started to sound, even about the money. I got a call from the CEO of Bear Stearns, then a big investment bank. And I didn't phone him. He phoned me, inviting me to go in and meet with him, which is not a normal thing to happen. And I realized that they were going on defense right from the get-go on this. And as I was looking into Jeffrey Epstein's finances and his story, by the way, about being a wealth manager only to billionaires was not the true story. He had a very complicated, muddy financial background. But as I was doing that, I stumbled across these two sisters, Maria and Annie Farmer. And Maria Farmer was an artist who had been hired by Jeffrey Epstein to curate his artwork when she was in her 20s. While she was doing that job, she invited her younger sister, Annie, who was then in high school, wanted to go to an Ivy League college, to come and stay with her for the weekend. And Epstein sort of took them, gave them VIP treatment, took them to the movies, put them in a limo, sent them to a Broadway show, but then invited Annie, then age 16, to go to his ranch in New Mexico. And with the idea, he said, well, I'd love to help you. I think you need more experience on your resume if you're serious about applying to an Ivy League school. And I would be happy to fund a trip like that for you, but I'd like to get to know you better. Ghislaine Maxwell made all the phone calls to Annie Farmer's mother, because of course any mother is going to be, reluctant to send her 16-year-old daughter from Kentucky or where they to stay with a much older man in a ranch in New Mexico. That weekend, it's both Ghislaine Maxwell gave Annie Farmer a topless massage, which made her feel terribly uncomfortable, and Jeffrey Epstein climbed into bed with her. And she kept quiet about it because she didn't want her sister to lose her job. But then her sister wound up also having a horrendous experience. She was doing some painting up in Ohio, where Les Wexner, a billionaire who was then Jeffrey Epstein's sort of chief beneficiary, chief client, has a vast estate. Jeffrey Epstein had a house on that estate. And one evening, Epstein and Maxwell came to visit, and they sexually abused Maria, who was so terrified that she sort of walked. There was a very long road to sort of the end of the estate where she waited for her father to come to drive and come and pick her up. They told me these stories on the record. Their mother backed them up. Eric Fischel, famous artist, he backed them up. So did a guy called David Schaffer. And they all said to me, yeah, the Farmers told us about this at the time contemporaneously. And I should add that obviously after Maria Farmer had her horrible experience, then her younger sister admitted to her what had happened to her in New Mexico. So they're on the record. We have it. And Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, I then put these allegations to them. They go berserk, absolutely berserk. And Jeffrey Epstein complained bitterly to my editor, Graydon Carter. He actually went into the office to talk with him. And at the 11th hour, at the very, very final draft that was being circulated as the article was going to publication, they were cut from it. And this happened behind my back.
Was it fear of legal issues that led Graydon and Vanity Fair to drop those allegations?
He has said that he thought at the time that Jeffrey Epstein would sue. And he has said that the Farmer sisters had said they wouldn't stand up in court. I'm trying to remember, it's a long time ago, if the Farmer sisters said they wouldn't stand up in court. I mean, now knowing what we know, the likelihood of Jeffrey Epstein suing, to be honest, would have been highly unlikely given all the skeletons that could have come out of his closet during discovery. I should add also in all of this, I had discovered that he was a complete con artist and liar and thief, and that his real mentor had been a guy who was sitting in jail just outside of Boston at the time I went to see him, and this man had committed the biggest Ponzi scheme in American history prior to Bernie Madoff. He, in fact, was Jeffrey Epstein. He taught Jeffrey Epstein everything he needed to know about the world of finance. And as I had got closer to the truth, Epstein had started to threaten me, and he started to threaten my unborn babies, and said things like, I'll have a witch doctor place a curse on them if I don't like this article, which is not really a nice thing to say to someone. Yes. And, and I'm going to have your husband fired. I'm going to make sure some of them were stupid. I'm going to make sure your children never gets into school in New York. But he also said, I know where you're giving birth, and I know all the doctors in Manhattan. And to be honest, the stress of this, I went into labor at 30 weeks, much too soon. And we were so my husband and I were so frightened of this man and what he might be capable of that we had to ask the security, for extra security in the neonatal ward where so both my tiny babies had health issues. They were so small and they were going to be there for the next 2 months. And
Y
and
You
it
got
was
an
just the
up-close
whole thing.
glimpse of how this guy pulled off what he pulled off for decades, huh?
Right. It did. And I remember being in absolute floods of tears about the farmer sisters being cut from it. I then went into sort of this, I then, my life immediately turned into having to deal with, tiny preemie babies with all sorts of complications. And I think that, I did about a year later, I got a call from the FBI. Somebody must have told them that they did ask me about the farmer sisters, and I told the FBI what I knew. And then, as we know, years later, in 2008, Jeffrey Epstein eventually did do that ridiculously cushy plea deal and go to jail for a ridiculously short amount of time. And I think in my head, I was and Ghislaine Maxwell was still floating around New York and sort of social scenes. And I think, sometimes I was trying to forget about her link to the whole thing in some ways. But then in 2015, the story bubbled up again when Virginia Giuffre went to the media with that photograph of herself with Prince Andrew with his arm around her waist and Ghislaine Maxwell standing in the background and claiming that she had been Epstein's sex slave and trafficked to many of his friends. And it was at that point, I think I came home one day and I actually found a British tabloid reporter in my hallway. But it was at that point that I was like, it's time now. And I phoned the Farmer Sisters and said, I think it's time that we spoke up. And so I did a piece for the Daily Beast saying that I really felt that what had happened at Vanity Fair had, I felt that Graydon Carter was hiding behind the excuse of the legal standards. That we know now. We know it wasn't the era. It was long before the era of Me Too.
Right.
But in the era of Me Too, I think it is accepted that if somebody stands up and says I was abused, and they you go to 3 people who remember them saying it at the time, that is the standard that meets the requirements to go ahead and publish.
It's a remarkable contrast in headlines, by the way, because the headline that Graydon eventually gave your piece in Vanity Fair in 2003 was "The Talented Mr. Epstein," and then the headline on your piece in the Daily Beast in 2015, "I tried to warn you about sleazy billionaire Jeffrey Epstein" in 2003.
Right.
I want to get at sort of the big picture here because there's a sense from some people that there was this global pedophile conspiracy ring run by Jeffrey Epstein, and that anyone mentioned in the files is linked in a very nefarious way. And it seems here as there was these sort of like two worlds of Epstein that sometimes crossed, right? There was the Epstein that was both the John and the client engaged in trafficking, in some cases, underage women and sexual assault and child rape. And then there's his rich power brokers network, boys club. We're seeing a lot of that as these emails come out. Are you able to help sort of like translate these
Yeah.
universes, this Venn diagram of Jeffrey Epstein?
I think it's something that I've harped on about in recent years and has gotten lost until these documents came out. That Jeffrey Epstein was a brilliant manipulator, not only of young, teenage, vulnerable girls. He was actually a brilliant manipulator of the uber elite. And I think that what and sometimes there was crossover, right? You see in some of the emails, like Steve Tisch, the owner of the Giants, using Epstein for, he wants to be introduced to, a woman. Is she a pro or is she a civilian? You see, there's obviously there is crossover, but you do see that actually Jeffrey Epstein was an extraordinary global networker, and that there was a lot of transactionality going on at this very, very high level with, guys, rich guys who wanted to meet each other, who wanted to do deals with each other. And there is Jeffrey Epstein in the middle, like a conductor, organizing the whole thing on a global scale. I mean, when you think about it, in England, Peter Mandelson, who's now had to resign from the House of Lords and from the Labour
Right.
Party, and he was,
Former
yeah,
UK ambassador to the US,
yes,
major power broker there, and it appears from this most recent round, the one who is getting the most of accountability right now and facing a criminal investigation.
right, because it turns out he gave market-sensitive information to Jeffrey Epstein about currencies that enabled Jeffrey Epstein and anybody Jeffrey Epstein would have been talking to, whether at JP Morgan or elsewhere, they could have made a trade and made a ton of money. And so I think you see, and we've started to see that he was very plugged into the Silicon Valley world and the world of tech. He was plugged in. I mean, it's extraordinary when you think, now I understand why he had any, reach into the Nobel Prize committee, because it turns out that, he knew the princess of Norway extremely well. It turns out that he had deep tentacles actually into the Kremlin, and that, he was in frequent touch with the Russian ambassador to the UN, Vitaly Churkin. He was in touch with Lavrov. And he was also, and at the same time, there's lots of talk of Gulf royals, African dictators. I mean, I think that, even I, who understood that he was what I called I made a podcast series called Chasing Ghislaine, which was really about the men in Epstein's orbit and the money. And I said that he was what's called in intelligence circles a hyperfixer. And because back in the 1990s, he was very, through Ehud Barak,
The
former Prime
former Israeli
Minister of
prime minister?
Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was able to talk to the Israelis and to Gulf state leaders at a time when those two countries were not talking to each other. He got, and he got close to Clinton. And, and again, it comes back to transactionality. Bill Clinton, yes, that I'm sure Jeffrey's network was helpful to Bill Clinton as Bill Clinton was coming into office in the 1990s. But when Bill Clinton left office, he needed money for the Clinton Global Initiative, which does, by the way, incredible work. Incredible, has saved, thousands of lives. But the sad fact is that the first donors to the Clintons Foundation was Jeffrey Epstein. So you can see, and how did he get to Bill Gates? Because actually, ironically, Bill Gates wanted to do good in the world. Bill Gates, in around 2010, along with Warren Buffett, they wanted to scale up their philanthropy. They wanted to meet other billionaires and really figure out how to give that money away in the most useful way. And so Bill Gates was introduced to Jeffrey Epstein, and Jeffrey Epstein had this idea that they could all work with JP Morgan and sort of create a fund. And the whole thing fell apart when JP Morgan didn't realize that Jeffrey Epstein intended, he wanted a cut of all of this. So you can see why. And now, of course, there's been this lurid, I think it went draft email of Jeffrey Epstein writing to himself about Bill Gates and all these STDs. And, and I think, and Bill Gates has said it's not, it's all rubbish. It's not true.
He said it's rubbish, but then we hear from his ex-wife, Melinda Gates, this week, who, based on her reaction, says that, no, he needs to answer for this, huh?
Well, she said, look, I think he has to answer these questions. And I watched her interview and she flinched And she said, you know, brings back memories she would like to forget. And I'm sure, what Bill Gates' mistake was, it was the same. All these guys, their mistake was that when you walked into Jeffrey Epstein's house, which I've done, there are, I mean, it was described as a harem in one of these men's emails. There is a crowd of young, beautiful girls, and it's just, it ought to strike any normal person as very odd. And I do know one Wall Street billionaire who told me recently, who's close with the Clintons and was a donor to them, that in about 2012, I think he was invited to a Clinton event at Jeffrey Epstein's house. And he said, well, who is Jeffrey Epstein? And he was told he was a Wall Street billionaire. My source said, well, I knew immediately that wasn't true, because if he was a Wall Street billionaire, I would have heard of him. I'd know who he is. He said, he's always punctual. He arrived on the dot before anybody else. And there were all these young women, inappropriately dressed, sort of rushing to offer him drinks. And he said there was something about the place that felt so off that I turned around and I just left. And I think that the problem that Bill Gates, I'm sure Melinda Gates, when she was married to Bill Gates, was saying, what are you doing around this guy? Because there is clearly something really off.
It didn't pass the smell test, and that's what
No.
I think you're seeing the aftermath here. I mean, on one end of the spectrum, you have people like, ex-Prince Andrew. On the other end, you have people like, Peter Adia and Richard Branson, who, makes a reference in one email to your harem that you came with.
Yeah.
And so, based on what we know, is there plausible deniability for some of these men who say, I didn't know what was going on. I was there for the networking.
No. I mean, I think that's exactly what we've discovered this week. No, I think they all said, oh, yeah, met him once. And then it turns out, Brad Karp, another guy I know who has had to step down as chairman from the Paul Weiss, huge law firm, because it turns out that actually he knew Epstein far better than had been let on, and that there were, and he'd been looking at, advising him even in 2019, giving him legal advice the year that the feds were closing in on Jeffrey Epstein. So I think that, that's exactly, all these men who said, oh yeah, really hardly knew him. Well, the proof is there for us to see. They absolutely did know him. And I think, clearly they thought that he could provide them with something that would give them an edge.
It's interesting because I've gotten a lot of outrage from people who, one of the hopes that I think some people had with the release of these files was it would lead to more accountability and potentially criminal convictions. And then you hear the number two of the Justice Department this week, Todd Blanche, say literally, it wasn't a crime to party with Epstein. There are higher standards here. And I wonder what you're telling folks who are frustrated, where, they had these sky high expectations with the files release. I was wondering what your expectations were, and, what your response is to people who are like, well, when are the heads going to finally roll here as to, what took place?
I think, actually it's important to read a couple of lines in Ghislaine Maxwell's habeas corpus petition. That's her, her filing for her appeal, where she talks about the fact that her criminal trial was leverage for 25 men to go and make civil settlements with various survivors. And one of the things that I do know from sources happened sort of in the shadows around all of this, a lot of these men, of course, they panicked and they have gone out and bought silence. I also think that, as you know, it is a function of, the way the American justice system works. is they'll flip the little fish to get to the big fish. And, it seems clear to me that some of the people seem to have been given immunity if they handed over the bigger people. And I'm thinking of Epstein's staff. And, it does seem clear that they must have provided the government with information that was helpful in getting indictments for Jeffrey Epstein and then Ghislaine Maxwell. And I think just unfortunately, that is how our system, I know I sound English, I'm American, our system works. And so that's actually why I didn't think that I didn't think that whatever came out would end up with more criminal prosecutions.
So effectively, it sounds like DOJ has now said these last 3 million or so pages, this is basically it. Um, how much do we have a sense of what is still missing? I mean, as somebody who's covered this story for a couple of decades now, Vicky, what is still missing? What question marks do you still have? Are there documents or videos or photos you suspect might still be out there that could bring clarity to the remaining questions we might have?
Yeah, well, for a start, there's like 2 decades missing. I mean, the emails don't really go back beyond 2002, and he made his money in the early 1990s. And when I typed in Les Wexner, the retail billionaire who made Jeffrey Epstein wealthy.
Yeah, just for background, Waxner is limited brands, so we're talking Abercrombie, Victoria's Secret,
Right.
Bath and Body Works.
Yeah. So, there's very little on him. Leon Black, who we know paid Jeffrey Epstein $160 million for, as he says, tax advice, but, and ended up having to step down as chairman of Apollo, the big private equity firm. Over this, I know this, he doesn't use email. So there are some documents in there, some interesting financial documents, but we're not going to really get to the bottom, I think, of what was really going on with their relationship. I think, sadly, I mean, I want to understand the money, because without the money, there would have been no sex crimes. When Jeffrey Epstein had no money in the 1970s and 1980s, there's no evidence at all that he indulged in this sort of predatory behavior. And I think that what he basically did was put money offshore for people. And I think that the Southern District of New York is not in the business of prosecuting, going after crimes they think they can't solve. And I just think it's something they wouldn't want to pursue. I mean, it's very difficult to find money that's been put offshore. So I think that's very difficult to pursue. I mean, I think that, I feel, listen, I think that Epstein survivors clearly want to see more heads roll, and clearly feel that they were, really done badly by this latest tranche. I mean, the fact that some of their biographical details were put out there when the whole point of the delay was supposed to be to protect them, I think is just it's galling, it's appalling.
Yeah, there were some of the victims' names were listed 100 times, more than 100 times unredacted in this
Right.
tranche.
Yeah. Meanwhile, names that were redacted were, for example, 2 Justice Department officials who had an email exchange in 2011 about how they needed to dig in over Jeffrey Epstein's plea agreement. And when Brad Edwards, the lawyer for many of the victims, was basically coming to them and saying, this deal was done illegally behind the victims' backs. They legally, by law, they should have been notified. And the position of these 2 unnamed individuals back and forth in their email is, we've got to dig in. What we did was legal, whether or not we think the content of the deal was right or wrong. In other words, they knew that that deal was absurd. And I do think you see that. I think you see very clearly Alex Acosta, who was the US attorney in Miami at the time, who signed off on this thing. You do see the friendly emails with Jay Lefkowitz, who was one of Epstein's lawyer. And, after Alex Acosta leaves office, who does he go work with in private practice? Jay Lefkowitz. I mean, Epstein was very, Epstein knew what he was doing. He knew how to work the system in his advantage. I think that some, like Brad Karp obviously had to step down. The NFL is now looking into Steve Tisch. I will be surprised if Goldman Sachs keeps Kathy Rumler as its general counsel.
Right. Top official Goldman Sachs, former Obama
White
counsel.
House. Yeah. I mean, the email, he sends her an email about Ken Griffin. I hear Ken Griffin's looking for a girl or something. And she basically writes back and says, oh, so in other words, you're going to send him one of your Russians so that I can get my comp. So one of Jeffrey's Russians. I mean, okay, explain that. I think probably a lot of women at Goldman Sachs probably would be furious to be reading all of these. There they are working away. This is the last thing.
Yeah, and you see that in some of the emails. It wasn't just men, right? Whether it's the Crown Princess of Norway, whether it's Fergie, Sarah Ferguson,
right?
This you can see the wink, wink, nod in these emails that they know what's going on.
100%, 100%. And I guess and Sarah, and again, but what's it all about, Mo? Money. Sarah Ferguson needed money. And he bailed.
She wanted him to pay her rent.
Yeah. And again, you see, what did Andrew want Epstein for? Money. You see that they were trying to put together a fund. Why was Andrew useful to Jeffrey Epstein? Because once upon a time, Andrew was, Britain's trade representative, which meant he got to fly around the world and go and meet various finance ministers. And, now, of course, one has to wonder whose plane was he flying on to go to these meetings and who might have been with him and how would he have that, and no wonder Jeffrey Epstein knew so much about, he traded currencies. That is something he talked to me about. That clearly was his passion. But in some ways, all of this reminds me of Ghislaine Maxwell's father, the business, the model, the business model, if you like. Robert Maxwell, her father, was a crook. But before it was revealed that he was a crook, he was a power broker and a spy. And he owned newspapers around the world. He owned a global publishing house. And he would jump from leaders, go from meeting to meeting with leaders of different countries. And it made him a very powerful person. And
that relationship, the Ghislaine Epstein relationship, did he seek her out because of the father? Was she attracted to Epstein because of her? Like, what do we make of that?
Well, clearly, Ghislaine Maxwell's Rolodex, which was essentially Robert Maxwell's Rolodex, was fabulous for Jeffrey Epstein. And as Jeffrey Epstein's predatory behavior got worse, he actually, ironically, he never went out. One of the reasons I had met Ghislaine and when I started that piece of Anti-Fair, I had absolutely no idea of any of this. Because Ghislaine Maxwell would go out and about solo, or she'd bring some guy, but Jeffrey Epstein never left his homes or his island. And so he conducted all of these things behind closed doors. So, it was Ghislaine who was going out and about and literally finding these young, vulnerable girls looking around. Now it makes all the sense in the world. But you would never have thought that that's what the daughter of Robert Maxwell would be doing. It was a fabulous disguise. Um, and she gave him, I think, well, she was very effective. We know. I mean, I sat through Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal trial, and all the victims who testified, all four of them talked about the fact that, well, they weren't afraid to go near Jeffrey because there was Ghislaine Maxwell, and how this sophisticated, polished global woman, if she thought it was okay to be around Jeffrey Epstein, then he must be okay. I mean, it was classic grooming.
What do you make of she's set to testify again, I guess,
Yeah.
behind closed doors to Congress next week. She had those interviews last year, suddenly is transferred to this very low security prison. Um, what what is your observation right now as to what that conversation is like with the Department of Justice, what that relationship is like, what she is saying in order to get a potential pardon here? Are you surprised by sort of I don't know if you can call it the rehabilitation of Ghislaine Maxwell? What exactly is she up to here, and why does it seem like the Justice Department is acquiescing?
Well, I think she's been subpoenaed, right? I mean, and I think
Yeah.
she's only doing this on, she demanded immunity and she hasn't got it. So I don't think she's going to do anything except plead the fifth and she's going to do it virtually.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I have a wager with Julie Brown, the journalist, who wrote the brilliant series in the
Out of the Miami
Miami.
Herald, she was one of the
Yes,
first reporters to really break.
yeah, really. Well, who actually had impact, and Julie thinks Trump pardons Ghislaine on his way out. I think Trump won't because, again, talk about transactionality. Trump is nothing if not transactional, and I'm not sure what's in it for him as he leaves
What do
office.
you make of Trump's reaction? I mean, it seems like anytime he starts to get questioned about it, you saw with Caitlin Collins from CNN in the Oval Office this week. You saw it on the plane a couple of months ago when he went after the reporter, calling her piggy. That was an Epstein question. Uh, It it really gets under his skin, and even people who are like, "Oh, I don't think he has anything to hide," they keep seeing this reaction. They're like, "Does he?" I mean, what do we know about eh, the Trump Epstein relationship, and why is it that the story um really leads to more questions and leads to the reactions that we've seen?
So you know what I actually think on this, and I know Trump. I reported on him and I got to know him quite well before he was president. What he doesn't like about this is that he's not in control of the narrative, and he's brilliant at being in control of the narrative, right? He's brilliant at waking us all up and flying in and capturing Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and then buying Greenland and then whatever he's up to next. But this, and I think it sort of come back to bite him because on the one hand, he campaigned on this issue, right? But I think on the other hand, he resents the fact that the Democrats, in his view, sat on this story and didn't release the files. And, I don't think that, there's anything in those files nefarious about Trump. I actually don't.
Th-
But none of the supporters, the survivors I've ever spoken to
yeah.
have ever said um, anything about being abused by Trump. Although it's clear that Epstein was fixated on Trump.
Oh, he
Um,
a lot of those references in the files. I mean, the several thousand references to Trump. A lot of them is just Epstein communicating with others about Trump.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Though
and
there
I
is
mean,
that Jane Doe allegation from 2016 that comes up
yes,
time and again.
that mysteriously went away. There is
Yeah.
that. There
Yeah.
is that. But I think it's that this thing. It's that Trump just can't get a lid on this, and Trump is used to being in charge of of the narrative.
And that's it. Given all the things, all the various anonymous tips, of course, the FBI said they couldn't confirm a lot of it. But then there's questions about did law enforcement effectively pursue some of these stories? But your sense is it's a narrative issue, not a they're going to uncover something I did issue.
I don't think it's they're going to uncover something I did. In some ways, Trump is on the right side. I mean, he wasn't always on the right side of history on this. He and Jeffrey Epstein palled around, in that it's not, again, going back to what we were saying with Bill Gates and Bill Clinton, it's not great judgment, right? Knowing what we know
I mean,
about
there's
Jeffrey
little
Epstein.
videos of them at a party with women.
Yeah, right. And Virginia Giuffre was recruited at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, none of this is politically helpful to Trump, but it does turn out he did chuck Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago, um, and they didn't speak, and they didn't speak for many years. So that's why I think this is not about this is he's irritated that. I mean, in a weird way, it's a sort of, you could look at it like a alpha guy ego thing. I mean, he's probably quite ticked off that people are talking about Jeffrey Epstein just as much as they're talking about Donald Trump. I mean, they did have this big feud, right, over this
Yeah.
house. It was really their big falling out.
Um, a lot of talk, and now we got a whole nother tranche of documents, but many people are convinced that Epstein was either working for the CIA, the Israeli Mossad, the Russians. What do we know? What is the closest to the truth there in terms of whether Epstein was an asset or was working for either U.S. intelligence or any foreign intelligence?
Well, he didn't need to work for somebody else's intelligence agency. He was almost running his own, all by himself. So in that sense, he was clearly a useful asset. I think you can see for many, many countries. I mean, he could give Prince Andrew information, Mandelson information when he was European commissioner. There's a guy in Poland who's just resigned his place. I mean, he even had a picture of the Pope a photograph of the Pope in his living room. So I think that
He was a one-man intelligence operation with the ability to blackmail some of the most powerful people on earth.
there you go.
So he didn't need to be on the payroll of the Mossad
No,
or Vladimir Putin or
he
the
did.
CIA.
He did not need to be on the payroll of anyone. But clearly he was. If you really take the time to go through all these emails, which would be a lot of time, um, he is trafficking information. He's trafficking information about currencies. He's trafficking information about who is going to be where. It's Bill Gates is going to be in Norway. Andrew is going to be in Afghanistan. Can I connect you? That is what he's doing.
But one of the questions we got, by the way, was related to just the way that he wrote the emails, not necessarily the content, but just the structure of them, the lack of punctuation.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have a theory on this?
Well, I think it's very clever. I mean, I think everything Jeffrey Epstein did is very calculated. And I think, he's trying to show, normally in this rarefied world, um, people care about appearances and, so it's correct spelling and things like that. And I think it was a way of saying, I'm very, very, very busy, too busy to be bothered. I'm bashing this out, and I'll answer you when I've got 2 seconds left. I mean, which was, all an act because it doesn't seem as though, in a weird way, Jeffrey Epstein did much actual work.
Um, Moving forward here, now that we've seen all of these documents release, where do you see this story potentially going? I know the idea that Brad Karp won't be the last one, and we're certainly seeing some of the other people named in the emails. But from what you're hearing from survivors, do we see is there another bombshell here or a major case that you think might happen here? Or do you think this is sort of the beginning of the end of the Epstein story?
I think it's the beginning of the end ish. I mean, it's become such a sort of political football in a way for Trump that I think it will, once he leaves office, the obsession with it, I think, will die a bit. But then other people like Ghislaine Maxwell one day will write a book. And so I don't think it will die completely. but I think that this is probably the last document dump that we're going to see, and yeah, the last
And
time people will be embarrassed.
what to make of Ghislaine Maxwell, and what to trust of what she says versus what is spin, her narrative here. I mean, certainly there's a group of, Ghislaine Maxwell apologists out there saying that, ultimately, she was hung out to dry here, that she's a scapegoat of sorts. And ultimately, is it sort of like when, OJ wrote his book? Like, what to make of Ghislaine Maxwell as she continues to put her narrative out there? And I imagine, eventually when she gets
Yeah,
out of jail, is going to be doing interviews and the like.
yeah. Well, I went through the transcript of what she said to Todd Blanche very, very carefully, and I mean, there's so much garbage in there. Um, it's
Garbage meaning
extraordinary,
lies. Yes.
and yes, but
Mm.
and couched in this very posh British accent. It was almost like they were having tea at Buckingham Palace instead of like sitting, i- presumably in a room in a prison. Um, but if Ghislaine Maxwell had the ability to tell, to sort of look outside of herself, I mean, her story is a very dark one. It is on one level tragic because I'm sure she was abused by her father. He was a horrible, terrible man who she adored. And, there's a story, my friend Tina Brown tells a story of how, someone said, Ghislaine took someone up to her bedroom, when she was sort of at Oxford, and and said, "Here are my hairbrushes. They're all neatly laid out, and Daddy lets me choose which one um, he's going to spank me with when I've been I've done something naughty." I mean, so
Mm.
he was a I think a dark influence in her life, and I think the tragedy of it is that a woman who went to Oxford University, who had that Rolodex at her fingertips, who spoke many, many languages, when her father died, and yes, suddenly she'd been an heiress to a vast fortune. Suddenly, turned out her father had been a crook. He'd robbed the pension funds of his employees. Her two brothers were going to stand trial. I mean, they were ultimately acquitted in London. Here she was in New York, and in her eyes, she was, homeless, penniless, desperate. And it's that in that moment that she and Jeffrey connect. And the tragedy of it is that she didn't have enough self-confidence to go out and make something of herself on her own. Because with all those things at her disposal, all the assets that she did have, she could have done it. Instead of which, I think she believed that Jeffrey Epstein was essential for her survival. And that's why this depravity got worse and worse and worse, because he, it was, he believed, he believed that it was the culture that was wrong, not him. That, in 100 years' time, it'll be quite normal to be, for men to be having sex with 14-year-olds. Um,
Right.
but she enabled him, I think, because he was paying. He was paying her. It
Um,
all, we come back to money.
we have a question here from Nikki, curious about what expectations will be around the Clintons testifying here.
Yeah.
It looks like they're making a deal where Bill goes one day, Hillary goes the next at the end of the month of February. Hillary claims she never met the guy. Of course, he visited the White House 17 times while Clinton was president. The former president rode on his plane 20 plus times. What what do you have lingering questions about the Clintons' relationship with Epstein?
Well, I think, if I were Bill Clinton getting on Jeffrey's plane, flying to Africa and looking around and seeing who the other passengers were and seeing all these young girls, I mean, come on. Uh, I mean,
And and
come
and and this,
on.
by the way, was just a couple years after being impeached over the Monica Lewinsky scandal.
Right. I mean, bad judgment. Absolutely not worth Um, I mean, it's going to be they're going to try to embarrass him, and he'll be he'll be embarrassed, and that'll be that. But and as we know, it sets a precedent, and down the road, then they can bring Trump in and ask him
Right,
all
but
sorts of questions too.
probably not as sitting president, but I guess if Democrats get
Yeah.
in Congress when he's former
Yes.
president,
Exactly. Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
a scenario there. You mentioned earlier, just want to close with this, yeah, the 2 dozen or so deals made during the Ghislaine trial or in the aftermath of the Ghislaine trial between, victims and men. I
Yeah.
imagine NDAs were signed, but we live in an era now
Yeah.
where even with NDAs, you sometimes see people speak out. Any sense that,
Yeah. But again,
how tight those NDAs are and whether any of the deals made in the aftermath of the Ghislaine trial, will be made public?
I don't think so. I mean, NDAs are enforceable, and again, it comes down to money, and I think there was a lot of money paid, and that's why I've often said, there are no really good people, other than the survivors around this story. I mean, because the lawyers involved all, are part of this transactionality in the shadows too. So, I do think it's ridiculous that Ghislaine Maxwell is the only person in jail for what was a huge, huge, huge pyramid scheme. Um, but there are people who've now lost their jobs. There are obviously John Luke Brunel, who was a huge part of it, died um, in prison. So, um, you know, but I think unfortunately this is just the nature of the way our justice system works.
We'll leave it there, Vicky. I appreciate you spending time, talking about it all, your personal story as well as your observations and your reporting. So, thank you,
Thank
and
you, Emma.
we'll chat again soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.